officially introduce Katie T. I remembered.
Hey all, I'm Katie. I'm an alcoholic. Hey. Grateful to be sober since July the 6th of 2011, and that is a miracle. Well, I thank Brandon for asking me to speak. I know he's in Rome enjoying, well, he's probably on his way home at this point, but he's a dear friend of mine, and I love this little group that y'all have found. This church is amazing. When I pulled in the parking lot and saw the coffee shop, I thought, wow, an AA meeting and a coffee shop connected. That's just perfect. So I feel like I've been to this church. Like there was another meeting back over in the corner. It might have been another fellowship at another time. Is that right? I see some heads shaking. Yeah. Okay. That might have been a number of years ago. Anyhow, so a couple things. My home group is the Legacy group in Plano. It's been my home group for about 5 or 6 years now. I grew up not far from here in North Dallas. And I have a sponsor. I sponsor people. And I say that because it's really important that I stay connected in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I grew up in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's really strange for me to be in a meeting where Daniel asked me if anyone was going to introduce me, and I kind of looked around the room and I said, no, just Katie T. And so it's kind of strange because I literally grew up in the Park Cities, not very far down the street, and I go to meetings all over the place, and I see people everywhere I go that have known me or known my mom who's been sober for 30 plus years. And so to be in a room where I don't know a whole lot of people is kind of different for me. So I'm looking forward to this. Y'all won't know if I'm lying either. So anyway, enough about that. So my story, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like today. So I grew up in a home where alcohol was very present, but I didn't really know that for a long time. I didn't really realize that, mom drinking on a daily basis and going to the neighbors and dad bringing her home and putting her to bed wasn't a normal thing. I'm the youngest of 5 and the only girl, so yes, I am a princess. I was treated like a princess by mom, or by dad and my 4 older brothers for a long time. And so, for a long time, that's how I lived. I was spoiled as a little girl by those 4 boys. And that's what I thought my life was. I thought this was like this perfect little home, and my family had these white pictures on the wall. We were all dressed in white, and down at Turtle Creek, and we didn't talk about what went on behind closed doors. So I thought, this is the perfect family. We went to parochial school my whole life and had some things that went on behind closed doors that probably weren't perfect, right? But I didn't know they weren't perfect because that was my family. And I had these great 4 older brothers. And my older brothers, there's like the 3 of them, they're each 18 months apart, and then there's a 6-year gap. And then there's my brother Adam, and 18 months later came me. And it's important to say that because that 6-year gap puts 11 years between me and my oldest brother. So while they're in high school having these crazy wild parties and my parents are traveling, I'm like 6, 8, doing Sprite out of beer bongs while they're having wild parties, kind of learning what that looks like. And then, I didn't fit in, though, with the kids in my school. If you take one look at me, I'm 6'3" today, and I was 6 foot by the time I was 8th grade. And I was very awkward growing up. I didn't do well in school, but I capitalized on other things to make it look like I fit in. I learned very quickly how to lie and manipulate. Having a mom that was extremely successful in business but drank, I learned very quickly to answer the phone and say, "This is Katie, how can I help you?" And they would tell me their name, and my mom would be sitting there or laying in bed, and no, I'm not available. So I immediately learned how to lie on the phone. And I didn't realize I was lying as a little girl, saying, "No, she's not here." just kind of became a working part of my mind. And that would play a part later on. And so growing up in that home, I just learned really early how to lie and manipulate. I learned how to change my grades because I was not a good student. I'd later learn that I was dyslexic, and that's why I wasn't a good student. But I would just change my grades on my report card, get my parents to sign it, change it back, and turn it into the school. Yeah, I don't really recommend that. And then, you know, once my mom got sober, I was really warned about alcoholism. I had that brother that was 18 months older than me, and he was drinking and doing a lot of outside issues early on. By the time we were 13 and 14, he was getting thrown out of the house, and I was warned, and I was like, I'm not going to drink or do drugs. And that kept me on the straight and narrow. I joined Alateen at 13 years old, and I was in the middle of the Al-Anon family groups at that time. So I didn't drink. So I was that kid that hung out at the conferences with my parents and all of that for a number of years. But I had other things. I had an eating disorder by the time I was 14 years old. Full-blown eating disorder, full trouble, trying to change the way that I felt, not knowing that I really just needed a drink. So that went on for a couple years, and then really got in trouble. And my parents said, you know, we've got to figure out something for her to do, and got me into sports. And I got into sports, and I became a really successful basketball player. I know that's shocking to you all, that might happen. And again, I was a bit of a chameleon. I wasn't a student, but people would tell me they wanted me to do something. I could set my mind to it and be really successful. And so that's what I did. I became a really successful basketball player. And when I went off to college, I had a lot of choices to go to college, and I chose to go to the West Coast. My mom wanted me to go to the East Coast, so I immediately signed that document saying I would go to the West Coast. And that's kind of how I lived my life. And again, hadn't had my first drink of alcohol. I got out to that West Coast, and I had a devastating injury that blew out my knee, and I immediately turned to alcohol and drugs. Had never had a drink, and found my first drink. And once I started drinking, it wasn't this progression. The book talks about, you know, the hard drinker, the real alcoholic. The first time I drank, I got drunk, and I was on a bus, and I drank orange Fanta and vodka in Europe, and they don't give you ice in Europe, and it was warm. And I got really sick on that bus at a rest stop, and I got back on the bus, and I looked at these people that I was on the bus with. I didn't really know them very well. And they were like, hey, you should probably slow down. They knew I was the youngest one on this big travel basketball team. And I looked at them and I said, well, can I have some more? And they're like, you should probably slow down. I said, I just threw up. There's no more alcohol in my system. And that's how I drank the first time I drank, and that's how I drank every time I drank after that. There wasn't this progression. So I went from that to this knee injury that allowed me to have a lot of outside issues and a lot of medications, and progressed very, very quickly into the disease of alcohol and addiction. And here I am in the West Coast, drinking and doing drugs, and my drinking looked something like, well, Katie doesn't really have to go to school because she's an athlete, so I had lots of tutors that took care of me and did school for me and did things for me. And then I had doctors that were my people that gave me whatever I wanted, right? And in San Diego, for those of you that aren't geographically inclined like I wasn't, you could take a trolley down to Tijuana and get drunk at 18, 19, which is how old I was, and that's what I did. And I had this boyfriend that would put me on the trolley, and we'd start drinking, and my friends would be like, meet us at Club 21, which was this great club in Tijuana, and I would get on that trolley with every intention of meeting my friends down there, and the next thing you know, it was the next morning, and they were saying, Katie, why don't you meet us down there? And I'd say, what are you talking about? My boyfriend would have put me back on the trolley, taken me home, put me back to bed, because I was a blackout drinker within a year. And that's what it looked like. And so that was the progression. And within 2 years, I was a full-blown alcoholic. They couldn't really keep me in school. They couldn't keep me in the dorms. I was on this full scholarship, and they'd kick me out of every dorm. I'd lived in 6 different dorms on campus. And I was living in graduate housing. And the lies were still there, right? I'd call my parents and say, I'm not coming home this summer. I'm going to teach summer school. I'm going to teach summer camp to the kids. I teach basketball in summer camp. Or, hey, I got to move dorms because I can't get upstairs on my crutches, so I'm going to move over to this dorm. Really, I'd been kicked out one more time. I'd stolen a keg and thrown it up in the trees, and the RAs didn't really care for those kind of tactics. And it was just one thing after another, you know, taking cars and crashing them and losing them. I just lose cars. I had this thing with a car once, and I went to the bar, and I came out, and my car was missing, and I was convinced that it was stolen or towed, and I called the police, and I was drunk. And I called the police, and no, ma'am, we didn't tow your car, and come to find out, like 6 months later, that it was in the impound the whole time, and they had registered it wrong, but the insurance had already replaced it. So wasn't my fault. They had towed it wrong, improperly. So you know, there weren't ever really any major consequences. So what happened there is it just progressed like that, and that was my addiction. And in 3 years' time, I went from this world-class athlete to this person who just wanted to get by. Like I went from these dreams of, you know, what my life was going to look like, and I was going to have this business degree and all these great ideas, to if I could just get through college, you know, if I could just finish enough school to get through college so maybe I could figure something out with my life. And I couldn't get there. I didn't make it to my junior year. I continued to get in trouble, and by 2.5 years into college, I was locked in a psychiatric hospital. I had overdosed and attempted suicide a number of times at that point. And, but I was an adult. I was going to claim I was an adult, and they couldn't call my parents. And once they called my parents because I was unconscious, all those memories of my childhood came back, and my parents were there when I came to at one of these hospitals. And I had hung myself in a hospital. And my parents were there, and they said, what are you doing? What is wrong with you? I was their perfect little girl that in Dallas, Texas, I'd go to church and these kids would want my autograph. Like I was a world-class athlete. And my dad took one look at me. He said, what's wrong? I said, well, you guys have no idea what I've done. None whatsoever. And I had this head full of the 12 steps, because you remember I was in Alateen. And I knew the 12 steps, and I had tried to go to AA at this point. It was a condition of me keeping my scholarship and them not calling my family. So I tried to go to AA. So I thought, you know, I can't live with alcohol and I can't live without it. So I thought suicide was the best option for me. And I attempted suicide, and I didn't succeed, obviously, or you'd have a different speaker today. So when I came to, and my dad asked me that, out came my botched amends process, which I don't recommend from a psychiatric hospital to your father of everything that you did when you were a child that was wrong. But I attempted that and told him all these lies that I had done. I mean, devastating things. And my dad didn't even know what to say because his baby girl was laying in a hospital. And my mom thought I had what was called repressed memory. She wasn't willing to believe me. So that debacle started a 2.5-year journey around the country in 12 treatment centers. And I say that I used to say that like boasting, like I went to 12 treatment centers and these people couldn't figure me out and I was really messed up. No, I say that today because what that did for me is it kept me alive long enough to hear a message in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's really what it did. And I landed after 2.5 years in Denver, Colorado, and I stayed sober about a year. And one more time, back to the races with my parents. And it was like the hamster on the wheel, like running. And I'd go in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this lady looked at me. I was in Young People's AA at the time. And God love Young People's AA. I mean, they have a lot of energy, like a whole lot of energy. And God love the old timers that put up with them. And so I'm at this young people's conference that I'd helped plan for a year, and I'd relapsed one more time, and this lady walks up to me and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm not going into that meeting because I have 3 days of sobriety and they're doing a sobriety countdown, and I'm not willing to stand up for that sobriety countdown with 3 days of sobriety, and I'm the secretary of this damn conference." And she said to me very clearly, and I remember it like it was yesterday, we could still smoke in hotels then. And I looked at her and she said, you're going through the women in the program like they're water. You're going to get cut off from the sunlight of the Spirit. You're not going to get this deal. And that scared me. It really scared me. And in less than 24 hours before that, I had been just going crazy, doing things in Aspen that I lived in Denver, and Aspen was a couple hours away, and I was scared, and I didn't know what to do, and my parents weren't sure what they were going to do with me. And I looked at her like a smart aleck kid would do, and I said, well, how do you know I haven't already been cut off? And she said, as clear as day, she said, well, my daughter sees a light in your eye, and her daughter was about 5. Danielle was about 5 at the time, and she said, and kids see the truth, and you haven't been cut off yet, but it could happen any day. And that lady became my sponsor. My parents, I got home after that conference because I hadn't seen them, and my parents were done. They had spent a lot of money sending me to all those treatment centers, and they handed me my car keys and said, good luck, we hope you don't kill yourself. We'll put some money in your bank account tomorrow. But this was after many years of them trying to help me. And that was in December of 2001. And if you heard me at the beginning, I'll remind you my sobriety date's not December of 2001. So from December of 2001, I went through the steps with that lady. Her name was Michelle Kay in Denver, Colorado. She was amazing. We went through all 12 steps, and she said, if you're going to be a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, you better learn what you're going to be a part of, and we're going to go through the steps and the traditions and the concepts. And that's what we did in Parker, Colorado. And we met in her basement, and we went to Parker Thursday night at 7:30. And when we went to Parker Thursday night, she said, be at my house at 5 o'clock. The meeting's at 7:30, you guys. We meet at her house at 5 o'clock, and we'd do step work for an hour, and then we'd go open the church, and we'd make the coffee, and we'd go to the meeting, and then we'd go to the meeting after the meeting at Perkins, and I'd be lucky if I was home by 11, 12, and that's what it was like. That's what it was early on for me, and I just began to take direction, because at that point I was teachable. And I went through all 12 steps, and the miracles of the program began to happen. And I went back to school, and I made amends to my family, and I lived in a halfway house where, you guys, I took a bus to a job where I left at 4 o'clock in the morning to work at the corner bakery. This little princess who grew up in the Park Cities, who was so entitled, and I loved that job because it was my money, and I was earning it for the first time in my life, and I didn't have anyone else telling me what to do. And I was free for the first time in my life. And I went to school and finished that process and came back to Dallas, Texas. I'll speed up in this story. But so really what happened in that time is I became free. And I worked the steps and the traditions and the concepts. And I moved back to Dallas, and I met him in the rooms. I'm pretty sure that's where I went to this meeting next door, was with him. And as a result of that relationship, I have a beautiful child today. We were never married. He relapsed when we were pregnant, and I have a beautiful little girl. Her name's Lily. She's 16 today. She's never seen her mom drink or do any drugs. But when I was pregnant with her, he relapsed, and so again in sobriety, I moved in sobriety, and I moved to Memphis, Tennessee, because my parents were in Memphis. And one more time, I called them and said, in sobriety, I need your help. And they took me back in and said, okay, but if we're going to help you here, there's going to be some rules. Okay, I can do rules. I could do this. And the women in Memphis, Tennessee took me in, and they surrounded me like the women in Alcoholics Anonymous do. And they surrounded me, and I went about my business there. And when that little girl started kindergarten, I looked at my parents. I said, it's time for me to move on. And I came back to Dallas, Texas. And yet I had this somewhat big ego, and I didn't have a sponsor when I came back to Dallas, Texas. I had 9 years of sobriety. When I moved back on my 9th birthday. I went to that Preston group down the street where everyone knew my name because I'd gone to Alateen there since I was 13. And they said, oh, that's Katie. She's great. She can speak on the steps, the traditions. We started the Pink and Green group. If anyone here remembers it, Travis used to come to it. But it was on, it was right behind Chewy's, right down the street. And it was the Romance and Finance group. And we did the steps and traditions. This was about 10 years ago now. And we started that group, and really all I was doing at that group was I was speaking. I was speaking on the steps and the traditions, and we would rotate Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I wasn't sponsoring people, and I wasn't active with a sponsor. I had my sponsor back in Tennessee and I had my sponsor back in Colorado, but I wasn't connected and I wasn't working the steps and I definitely wasn't doing 10, 11, and 12. And it took me 6 months from the day that I moved back to Dallas, Texas, to call my friend Frank and say, Frank, I don't really want to go see fireworks with you tonight. I want to go have a glass of wine with those moms from my daughter's school because I'm probably not an alcoholic. I was probably just a drug addict. Now, given everything I've just told you and all the things that I did, I couldn't bring any of that to my memory like the book talks about. So he said, well, why don't you come over and we'll talk? Now, there's a couple keys in that. I didn't call the women in Alcoholics Anonymous. I called my friend Frank. Now, Frank's a good guy. He had 30 years of sobriety. And I went over to his house and I talked to Frank and he wanted me to pray and I wasn't willing to pray. And he wanted me to talk about the first step and I wasn't willing. I just wasn't willing. And he said, you know, we met at his parents' house because it was much closer to mine. And he said, there's alcohol in that closet right there. If you really want to drink, why don't you drink somewhere safe rather than go meet those moms? And I stood up in front of that man and I poured myself a glass of Jack Daniels because that's what I drank. And after 9.5 years, in less than 5 hours, I had gone from totally sober to drunk in handcuffs on my way to the psych hospital. And that's what it looked like for me. And I don't really remember exactly what happened that night because again, I blacked out. Like it hadn't changed at all. Nothing had changed. He had taken me home and by the time we got to my house, the people we were meeting, everyone I knew was in Alcoholics Anonymous. People we were meeting were at my house and they were all sober 20 years. And I guess, I mean, my daughter was out of town. That's the gift in that. And what I'd say is that my daughter at that point had become my higher power. And if your higher power is capable of going out of town, then you probably need a new higher power. And that's what I learned from that. She was 6, by the way. So we got back to the house and all these people were at the house and I was drunk out of my mind and I just wanted to sleep and they wouldn't leave. So I took a bunch of pills and one thing led to another and the cops ended up coming and arrested me on my front porch in Park Cities. Now, if that's not humiliating and the neighbors and the kids. And so off I go to Green Oaks 5.5 hours after I started drinking. And I got out pretty quick because I'm pretty smart and manipulative and can lie and find my way out and call people that have own treatment centers, right? And they come check me out and say, she'll stay with us this weekend, we'll take care of her. And they did that and I went to my home group, that pink and green group, and they said, are you done? And I said some pretty expletive things to them. Like, I don't know, y'all locked me up last night, so I don't know if I'm done. They said, stay away from the drugs and the high bridges, and we'll be here when you come back if you need us. Find out if you're really an alcoholic. Because at this point, I still wasn't convinced I was an alcoholic, right? I still wasn't convinced. I was convinced that I was a drug addict, but I still wasn't convinced that I was an alcoholic. Like maybe I could just drink that wine normally. I still had never had a glass of wine in my life. And I was teaching school. I was a teacher at this point. And I went to school the next day and all the kids are, Miss Katie, how was your 4th of July? Oh, it was great. It was great. I was in the psych ward, but it was great. And so, you know, I went to school that day and I went to the meeting that night and they said exactly that. And I went to the meeting and I left the meeting. I didn't even go to the meeting. They said, then stay away from the drugs and the high bridges and find out if you're an alcoholic. If you need us, we'll be here when you come back. And I stopped at Tom Thumb. I don't know why. I bought 3 bottles of wine because 3 bottles seemed reasonable if I was going to try a glass. Yeah, I think it was 2 bottles of red and 1 bottle of white because I didn't know what I liked. I'd never tried it. And I went home and I drank all 3 bottles of wine while they were in that meeting. And I couldn't get drunk. Talking just like I'm talking now. And I started calling them. They're still in the meeting. And they get out of the meeting and they're going to fellowship and they're like, stop calling us. Figure out what you want. And that went on for a couple more days and I was convinced. It wasn't like this big light experience happened or I went back to jail or any of that happened. None of that happened. I still have never been to jail. Thank God. But, you know, the truth of the matter was that I couldn't control and enjoy my drinking. I had lost the power of choice. The mental obsession had taken over, and there was no, oh, I crossed this line. There was bottle after bottle after bottle, whether it was wine or Jack Daniels or vodka or whatever it was. And I didn't understand what had happened. And, you know, when I'd moved back to Texas, I had probably, let's just throw a number out there, 20 AA books that I'd collected in the last 9.5 years that were still in a duffel bag, right? Because in Tennessee and in Colorado, it was really common back then to give people a book in recovery for their birthday or anniversary. So I had lots of books that people had written in, hey, happy 1 year, happy 3 years, and they'd write little messages in. You can't give those away when they're written in them, right? So they just ended up in a duffel bag when I moved back to Texas. So that night after I'd had, I don't know, a couple drinks, a couple bottles, I don't really remember, and these people in AA weren't calling me back because I was well past conversation point, I dumped those books on my bed. And one of the books was this red book that caught my eye. It had gold lettering on it, and I think they've changed the cover since then, but it said, Came to Believe, right? And I was convinced of the first step. I was convinced that I was an alcoholic and was powerless and couldn't control my drinking. My life was completely unmanageable because I couldn't do or live the way that I was living. So I read this book, right? And I just started in the beginning and started reading it. And it's little excerpts of individual stories from the grapevine of how people came to believe. And in this book, what it would say is, guys, it was real complicated. Invite God into your life or ask God how he can help you today. I mean, it was real complicated stuff, and to me it was mind-blowing. And I got on my knees and I read some of that stuff. And my toes started to tingle and my fingers started to tingle, and I thought, thank God the alcohol's finally working, right? That was my mindset. And I climbed back up in bed, and it stopped, and I got back on my knees, and it started happening again. And it was the beginning of this spiritual experience, and I called this lady that I had been with. Oh, I should probably back up. The night before that I called Frank and started drinking, I ran into my daughter's father at an alumni event of a local treatment center where his wife was working with their new baby. Now that's telling because I had a pretty big resentment against him, and running into him was not something I had planned. And I had driven out there with a lady that I had known for quite a while in Dallas and just was friends with. So I called that lady, who would later become my sponsor, and told her what was going on, and she said, okay, so are you ready to come back, and are you ready to start working the steps? And so that was my opportunity. So we started working the steps, and that's what it looked like, and that's what happened. So after 9.5 years, I got to come back into Alcoholics Anonymous after about 4 or 5 days of drinking, and that's a blessing, because that doesn't always happen, right? I mean, I was in and out of the program for a number of years in the beginning, and so I came back in the program. And the miracles began from the very beginning. In the very beginning, I was like 30 days sober, and I was teaching summer school in Farmers Branch, and my daughter's going to school in the Park Cities, and it was a nightmare. And I hated it. I hated every minute of what I was doing. And I was lying to everyone. They were like, well, how's your life? Oh, it's great. You know, I've got this great house in the Park Cities and yada, yada. And, you know, I didn't have a house in the Park Cities. My parents have been paying my bills my entire life. And yet I'm telling everyone, like, everything's great, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that. No, none of that was true. And I was lying to myself, but I had come to this realization that that was the truth. And so I had this opportunity to apply for a job at the Park Cities Y, teaching alcohol and drug education to the kids. And I went to this job interview. I'm 30 days sober. And I went to this job interview, and they said, we're looking for somebody that's a licensed teacher that can do this. And I go to this interview, and the lady's like, so you've been around the program for 10 years. This person who had referred me told him that. And I said, yeah, I've been around the program for 10 years. That's right. And I went home that night, and I talked to my sponsor about it, and she's like, well, you didn't lie. Nope, I didn't lie. But that thing in my gut said, this isn't right. And I picked up the phone and I called that lady that interviewed me, who had known my family for a long time, and I told her what had happened and how I had less like 30 days. And she said, great, when can you start? We need somebody who's going to be real and honest with these kids, that's going to tell the truth. And I started in that job, and I started working in the recovery community. And I will tell you, it's been like this jet plane that I've been on ever since I started that. Because I was thrown right in the middle, not only in that career, but right in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous again. It wasn't like I could be working with these kids and doing these things without working a program. I didn't really have an opportunity at that point. And, you know, it's kind of like when I started sponsoring again, and you know, the shame that I felt of going and getting a new chip, and, you know, and that was all ego, right? It was 100% ego, and it was 100% of me, you know, not wanting to do or say what I had done. And I remember calling my parents and telling them, and my daughter had to fly home. She was in Colorado that week that I drank, and my daughter had to fly home, and I picked her up at the airport. She actually had a broken collarbone when she came home, and I called my parents, and I was so angry with them. And I told them what had happened, and they said, well, we're coming to get her. She's not staying with you if you're drinking. You cannot take care of a child. And somehow God protected that, right? And one step in front of the other, and Kim, my sponsor, took me through the steps one by one in the book. And, you know, I was so green. I would get at the podium and I would cuss. She took me to some women's conference out in the boonies. It was somewhere in Oklahoma. And we stayed in these cabins, and it was not my cup of tea, you guys. I don't do camping. And I'm sure it was a wonderful, beautiful place. But I was not there. I was like, you know, a couple months in at this point. And that eating disorder had cropped back up, and I was a mess. And I didn't really want to show up for that. And so we walked through a lot early on. And the women in Alcoholics Anonymous, again, just surrounded me. And it wasn't this big shame spiral that I had created. See, most of what happens in my life, I create. I was telling my friend Naomi when we were driving out here, most of what happens in my life, I create this pedestal that I put myself on, that I have to be perfect. And, you know, if I don't perform at this level, then I'm a failure, right? And that's just not true, right? And so what happened is I got to go through the steps and realize that all those things, especially that I learned in 4 and 5 and my character defects, were self-made, were me trying to show up and be better than I was. So I didn't really lose those 9.5 years. I still learned quite a bit in Alcoholics Anonymous. I still have all the knowledge that I learned of the steps and the traditions and the concepts, which is fabulous knowledge. But knowledge didn't keep me sober, right? And so when I went through the steps with Kim, I got to get real and I got to get free. And just like I did the first time, but the difference now versus then is that I get to keep doing it, right? I can't just stop. And God reminds me that on a regular basis. He's got quite a sense of humor. My sponsor will say things like, well, how free do you want to be? Well, I'm pretty free. I think I'm good. I think I'm good today. I don't think I need any more spiritual growth. I've had quite enough pain for today. Thank you very much. Right? And that's the truth. Right when I think like I'm good, everything's good, I'm keen, there'll be some other big thing happen. So in the last 10 years, so I did just celebrate 10 years of sobriety, which is a miracle because this is all new to me, right? I didn't make it this far last time. And it was like a game of whack-a-mole, right? At 3 years of sobriety, I reached out to my parents, and that beautiful daughter of mine was struggling in school, and I pulled her out of school, and I sent her to a special school. And I will tell you, I became fully self-supporting in that process because I didn't have the support. It was like time to break up with the family and time to become self-supporting. And it wasn't an easy process. And I joined Al-Anon family groups for the first time as an adult. I got to go and make amends to her father. And I will tell you, my daughter's favorite thing to do today is have family dinner. Now, when I say family dinner, our family is me and her, but her family is me and her dad and her stepmom and her 5 siblings, right? So we all get together and have family dinner. And I'll tell you, it's actually fun. It's fabulous because her mom, well, her stepmom, but she calls her her mom, which is perfectly fine with me because we're free. And part of that forgiveness for me in working through the steps with her dad is forgiveness for him, but forgiveness for me too. And forgiveness for her stepmom, who she calls her mom. And so it's fun because we're all in recovery, right? Both her dad and her stepmom and her older sister are all in recovery. So we all get to be together, right? That's the program, right? And that's the deal, is that we put our kids first. And so that little girl has grown up with 3 parents and a lot of love. And so, you know, when I was 3 years sober this time, I sent her off to this other school, and she got a lot of help at that other school. And they said, you know, she can do whatever she wants in high school, and she's thriving in this great school down the street now. But we struggled for a long time. And in 2016, I was in a car accident with her in the car. And in that car accident, I was T-boned in downtown Dallas, and I had a back, neck, and brain injury and was told I would never walk, talk, or function again. And you guys, clearly I'm talking just fine because y'all are about ready for me to sit down and be quiet. But the truth of the matter is, those doctors told me that was the truth. And I spent 6 months in Baylor Hospital, and I spent another couple months in the rehab hospital learning to walk and function. I spent time trying to stack a yellow block on top of a blue block. And the humility that it took trying to carry a glass of water with my walker from my bedroom into my bathroom or into the other room, and having to call. And the day we came home from the hospital, I remember my daughter being in her room crying. And I said, "Baby, what's the matter? I'm home. Like, aren't you glad that I'm home?" She'd lived with her dad and her grandparents through this process. And she said, "I'm glad, but will these people ever leave?" And I go, "What are you talking about?" And she was talking about my grand sponsor making the chicken soup in the kitchen. She was talking about the nurse in AA that was organizing my medication. She was talking about my sponsor that was in the kitchen organizing the schedule of who was going to sit with me over the next 6 months and drive her to school because I couldn't drive. She was talking about the guys that were hanging rails in the bathrooms because I was handicapped and couldn't stand up, and so they were hanging handicap rails all throughout my house. And that's what she was talking about. She was like, "Are we ever going to get our lives back?" And I'll tell you that maybe a year later, we went from everyone taking care of us to just her and I living in that house. It's just her and I. And that's a miracle. But what the miracle is that Alcoholics Anonymous one more time came around and surrounded us. And we walked through that. And they brought us food every night, and they drove us to doctor's appointments. And there were a lot of doctor's appointments. And not just physical doctor's appointments, but mental doctor's appointments. There was a lot of trauma that went with that car accident. And you know, to be able to go through that, and I had no short-term memory. I couldn't tell my story for quite a while. And the women in the program were like, "That's just fine. You probably need to get off that podium and start cleaning ashtrays again." Right? And that's what it was. And that's what it looked like, right? And you know, and then the pandemic hit, I got laid off from my job. I'm a single mom with a mortgage and a house, and I've been self-supporting. And that was the best thing that ever happened, was being self-supporting. So what do I do now? And I had this great severance that came along, and all of a sudden, God said, "You're not supposed to work in that industry." And I got to go work for this hospital instead. And so I've been working for a hospital system for the last, 10 months now. And it's been a miracle. And it's like, okay, God, what's next? And you know, I don't get to know what's next, but I get to know on a daily basis that as long as I do what the book says, which when I was, right before I got laid off, I called my friend and I was driving home from work, and I was complaining about work, because that's what we do. I mean, I have this fabulous job, and I call him and I'm complaining, and he said, "Well, what's your purpose? Like, what are you supposed to do?" And I'm telling him about what I do for a living, and he's like, "No, what's your purpose?" And he was trying to get me to the purpose in the book, where we fit ourselves. And he said, "We what?" He goes, "We fit ourselves." He said, "That means we do it when it's not convenient, Katie." Oh, okay. So today, as long as I show up and I fit myself to be of service, everything else works out. Like, I don't get to know what the plans and ideas are. I invite God in on a daily basis, and I didn't know what that was when I started. My sponsor told me for like 6 months, invite God into your life on a daily basis. And after 6 months, I finally surrendered, and I said, fine, how do I invite God in? She said, it's a secret. Okay, what's the secret? She said, God, I invite you in. So on a daily basis, I invite God in. I try to fit myself to be of maximum service. And I show up. I show up for that family. I show up for my parents that I tortured for a number of years early on. And today they're not in the best of health, but they do call. They called last night. They're like, we haven't heard from you in 4 days. And I didn't correct them and tell them that I texted them earlier in the day. Instead, I just said, I'm sorry, I'll call you more often. This is the kid that they didn't really want. Remember, they said, go, we don't want to talk to you. Please leave our house. They call me and ask me, am I okay today when my kid's traveling? So, those are all miracles of the program. And today I just get to suit up and show up and I try not to tell God the plans for the day, because when I do, he tends to laugh at me. Otherwise, I am blessed to be here. I'm grateful that this talk is nearly over. It's been really awesome, but I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel. I think there might be some chips and birthdays. Thank y'all.